Welcome back to Vintage HLC Show and Tell. Today we're going to look at some Virginia rose treatments. Virginia rose was first developed in late 1932, was introduced in 33, and was made all the way to the late 1960s. The latest backstamp I've ever seen for Virginia rose is from 1968. So because this line was produced for such a long time, there are all kinds of patterns that appear on it. There are patterns that appear that were made specifically for Virginia rose. There are patterns that were made for other shapes that made their way onto Virginia rose later on. So we'll look at the back stamp first, because this is where some of the confusion arises when it comes to Virginia rose. We see the fleur-de-lis marking up top, then Homer Laughlin, Virginia rose, made in the USA, and then the date code underneath. This one comes from 1947. Now, Virginia rose was the first shape to have the shape name, Virginia rose, along with Homer Laughlin's name in the back stamp since Quaker in the 1920s. So the shapes between Quaker and Virginia rose, that would be, let's see, Yellowstone, Knoll Trellis, Old Roman, Wells Century, Jade, Orleans, and Ravenna. None of those will you find both Homer Laughlin and the shape name in the back stamp. So when people find this, you may have a situation where a collector will post one of these on a message board or Facebook or whatever, and they'll say, oh, here's my Virginia rose set. And then someone will say, well, that's not Virginia rose. Mine doesn't look like that. They may have this pattern. These are the two most common patterns that were used on the Virginia rose shape. So they think Virginia rose is the actual decoration and not the shape. So that's where some of the confusion arises. So Virginia rose is a scallop shape. It's a rim shape. It has periodic rose embossings. And the shape was named after Virginia Rose Wells. So this pattern is VR128, and it was made for G.C. Murphy. Collectors call this Fluffy Rose, although when G.C. Murphy would issue purchase orders to Homer Laughlin, they'd often call it Cosmos, but we don't call it Cosmos, it's just Fluffy Rose. This one is JJ59, which was made for J.J. Newberry 5 and dimes. Another common treatment is this one, VR124. This is Patrician, which just has silver lines, and then the little embossings have these platinum stamps. So now we'll look at some of these other patterns, because there are hundreds of patterns on Virginia rose. But before we get into that, I have to mention this. The Collector's Guide to Homer Laughlin's Virginia Rose, Identification and Values by Richard Ratcheter. Because he wrote this book and identified a lot of the patterns that are on Virginia rose. The company that printed this, Collector Books, they're now out of business and this book is now out of print, but you should be able to find it on eBay or Amazon.com. It goes into a lot of the shared treatments. For example, this one, we have Virginia rose casserole, and here it is on a Yellowstone platter. Here it is on Quaker. So you get to see a lot of the overlap of the different shapes. So you should be able to find one of these books, probably relatively cheap nowadays. But again, that's Richard Ratcheter. He names a lot of treatments. So as I go through this video, if I say this is a Ratcheter name, I'm getting it from this book. So again, JJ59, very common treatment. We call this moss rose. I believe this originated with the Orleans shape, though you will find it on Virginia rose more than any other shape. And of course there's VR128 and VR124. Now, this one is Woodland Gold, a Ratcheter name, with some gold stamps, gold trim. We've seen this pattern before in the Garland video. This is VR126, so we have our Garland stamps in platinum. Usually you'll find this on Century in gold, as well as some specialty pieces. This one is dated 1942. This is one of my favorite treatments Homer Laughlin has done. Wild Rose, VR269. It originates on Yellowstone, but was also used on Virginia rose. On Yellowstone, it was sold through, I'm trying to think for a moment, Butler Brothers catalogs, and that's where the Wild Rose name comes from. Of course, here's our VR128 again. Tulips and Basket with red trim. That is going to be VR285. There are several variations. We'll look at those in a moment. We have an unusual pattern with orange trim. You don't see a lot of orange trim on Homer Laughlin wares. This is VR376. and comes from 1937. We'll look at a couple of stacks of platters. This one is Melody of Fruits, a ratcheter name. This is VR 265. Just a scrap print. You probably won't find a full line of dinnerware. We're going to see several of these specialty pieces in a moment. But this is probably a factory second where they just put on this decal. Homer Laughlin didn't waste very much back then. If there was something that had a defect in it or something that they wouldn't use in a standard line of dinnerware, they just put a decal on it. They might put gold stamps. They might put some jet spray, which we'll see that in a moment as well. This one comes from 1944. Tulip pattern. This was used on Wells as well as Century, so it's a little unusual to see on Virginia Rose. This pattern was used on Liberty and Rhythm as well in the 1950s. Dogwood. Orange pattern with red trim. Meadow Goldenrod. This is a rather common treatment. Sometimes it's found with two sprigs, that is, you'll have one decal over here, one decal over there. This has platinum trim. There are all kinds of variations for Meadow Goldenrod. This is what I was talking about using scrap prints for specialty pieces. I'm going to go over here for a moment and grab a Yellowstone plate. This is Rosetta. This is a standard line of dinnerware. This was also sold through Butler Brothers catalogs with black trim and black verge line. And here we see that same decal used on Virginia Rose with this blue wash trim. And I don't know if that's going to show up, but there's a lot of like bite marks in the clay right there. So this would have been a factory second. They would not have put this in with a line of dinnerware, so they just throw on this scrap print and give it the spray, and then they just sell it at a discounted price. This one comes from 1949. Single sprig decal with platinum trim. Another Butler Brothers pattern. This one has red underglaze hand-painted work on the embossing, which is actually rather rare. This is VR 334. Now VR 319 is much more common, and that is your green version. I think I'm going out of focus here. There we go. All right, there's your green version. Ratcheter called this pattern Wings. Again, VR 319, and there's your red version, VR 334. Not nearly as common as the green version. Tulips and Basket. This one has platinum trim. We saw the sugar bowl with the red trim. And there should be one over here. There's a version with gold trim. So the platinum trim is VR 396. The red trim is VR 285. The gold edge is VR 412, and no edge at all is VR 414. So every time they altered the pattern by changing the trim color, it would get a new treatment number. Another scrap print. This basket decal was used largely on theme eggshell as well as Georgian eggshell. Here it is on a Virginia Rose platter with this pink wash trim. And you can probably see the little defects in the glaze. And on the bottom, a turkey platter. So Homer Laughlin used this turkey decal on a lot of different pieces. We may do a video simply devoted to this turkey decal because it appears on virtually every shape from the 40s and 50s, including Fiesta. This casserole, probably my favorite Virginia Rose treatment other than the Wild Rose, and simply because it comes from Hudson. So this has its treatment number. It's VR 119. And we have it on a Hudson creamer. Now, this pattern would have originated sometime around 1906 or 1907, and here we see it in the 1930s. It's the only treatment that I know of that originates on Hudson that ends up on Virginia Rose, because usually the Hudson treatments are all gone by the late 1920s. But this one sort of sticks around for a little bit. I have a feeling this is going to be dated early 1930s. It is 1933, the first year it was introduced, so January 1933. that's your Hudson treatment. Center decal, you'll find this on Theme Eggshell. I think it's TH11 on Theme Eggshell. Here it is on Virginia Rose with gold trim. Sun Porch, very popular decal on Kitchen Craft, as well as Century. You can see the little Fiesta pieces on the table. Of course, we saw our green wings. There's that Rosetta on Yellowstone. Now this pattern, Ratcher called Muriel. And he calls it Muriel because a lady who sent him in an example, her first name was Muriel, so she gets an honor in having a pattern named after her. Here it is with just platinum trim, and here it is without trim but gold stamps. This is a treatment that originates on Yellowstone, I believe. That's black leaf and orange and yellow decal. No trim. Comes from 1933. Pastel Rose. This originates on Coronet. It's also used on jade. Actually, I take that back. It might have originated on jade, but it was used on both jade and Coronet. With platinum edge line, as you see here, it is VR 365. With gold edge, it's VR 384. Red Stripe. This one is VR 158. And it comes from 1937. There's our Wild Rose pattern again. We'll compare it with the sugar because the sugar had to have smaller versions of the decal. Rather late treatment. This one is VR 437. It was also used on Georgian Eggshell. So this one comes from 1957. I don't know the treatment number for this one, but you will find this on Liberty quite a bit. It's L442 if I'm not mistaken. This is Nosegay, which was made for Sears and Roebuck. And there should be a special marking on this one. So we have a silver or platinum overglaze stamp made in America for Sears, Roebuck & Company Fine Dinnerware Nosegay. And Red Beauty, very popular treatment. You'll find this on a lot of Homer Laughlin shapes from the 1930s. Chelsea, Yellowstone, Wells, of course Virginia Rose, as you see it here with platinum line. Comes from 1934. I wanted to show this piece because this is the bread plate. I showed the cake plate in a video not too long ago. This is the smaller version with its little tab handles. So cake plates are very difficult to find in this Virginia Rose shape. An 8-inch plate being used in a children's set. Little Boy Blue. There would have been a jewel mug that went with this. It comes from the 1950s. In fact, this one is dated 53. This was probably decorated by an outside company. Even though Homer Laughlin, you did use this decal, it just doesn't look like Homer Laughlin's work because there's no trim. The decal's somewhat off center. It comes from 1947. Another piece decorated by an outside company, Colonial Couple decals with gold stamps. We see some defects in the clay. So this would happen quite a bit, where Homer Laughlin would sell off seconds to decorators, and then they would just put whatever they wanted. We're going to see several of those examples right now. So they're usually overdone. We see all this gold stamping, we've got this gold trim, we've got a gold verge line, we've got a decal, so we've got all these decorative elements. So this, you can tell by looking at this, without even looking for any type of marking, that this is an outside decorator. They're very distinct. And we see Royal China, 22 karat gold. That is not to be mistaken with the Royal China Company from Ohio. Rhythm Rose, but this time with gold stamps. Again, this is probably an outside decorator, even though it's not marked as such. Well, it does say warranted 22 karat gold, but it doesn't have a secondary maker's mark. So even though Homer Laughlin did use this decal, a lot of potteries and a lot of decorators had access to this decal during the late 1940s and 1950s. A mossy type rose decal with some unusual stamping over the embossing. And this one does have a secondary stamp, Royal LB 22 karat gold. And they've stamped it over the Homer Laughlin underglaze marking. And another one that's quite overdone, a very large center sprig. We've got all this gold stipple. We have this fern stamping going on. Again, you should be able to look at something like that and go, yeah, Homer Laughlin didn't do that. An outside decorator did. And again, we see the L&B Royal Backstamp 22 karat gold. Homer Laughlin's mark is from 1946. So this complicates matters a little bit, not only Virginia rose, but other shapes as well, where you're collecting and you want to try to get as many treatments as possible or patterns as possible, and then you start adding in all these outside decorators, whether they're marked or not, so it increases the number greatly. Because these are just a few that I'm showing you. Some of them are going to be very elaborate with a lot of gold, like Pacific China was one that decorated with a lot of gold. This is the gold version of Patrician. Patrician we saw with platinum. This is the gold version, where we have the gold trim and gold stamps. This one is VR115. Rose decal with no trim. Mums with gold trim. You'll find this on Yellowstone, a couple other shapes as well. Platinum stamps with a pretty strong platinum verge line. Spring wreath, another treatment that's used on a lot of Virginia rose, well, a lot of Homer Laughlin shapes, I should say. You'll see this on Liberty and Kitchen Craft and Republic. Pettipoint rose, this was a Cunningham and Pickett treatment. Should have gold trim. Probably done by an outside company, the Sleeping Mexican treatment. No trim on this one, although it doesn't have a secondary stamp. This is from 1944. Colonial Kitchen, another treatment that was used on a lot of Homer Laughlin shapes. Here it is on Virginia rose with gold trim. A couple souvenir plates, one San Francisco, one Los Angeles. Center decals, and then we see our stamps. Actually, there's two different types of stamps on these. That one's dated 52, and this one is dated, both are dated 1952. We'll look at a couple bakers, and then that'll be it. Because the bakers, as well as the casserole lids, almost always have the treatment numbers, which is very helpful. So this one is VR205. And this one is VR106, but the only difference between this one and that one, well, there are two differences. First of all, this has platinum trim, this one has gold trim, and it has the other difference is this additional gold stamp on the verge. But it makes use of the same decals. Another one with some gold stamp on the verge. This one is VR209. Exotic bird decal, you see this on Yellowstone and Chelsea, a couple other Homer Laughlin shapes of the 1930s. On Virginia rose, it's VR192. Another border decal on the verge, platinum trim, VR270. And we can see what this one looks like with a sugar bowl. There's the VR270 sugar that goes with it. And it comes from 1935. This one I think is called Bouquet, made for Woolworths. An orange rose with gold stamps. And a couple more specialty pieces. Again, throwaway or scrap prints. This was a treatment that was used on a lot of different versions of Cavalier eggshells. Some have green trim, some may have gray trim. Here it is with this tan jet spray. And another theme eggshell decal, this time with this teal border from 1956. So there are literally hundreds of different patterns and treatments on Virginia rose. It's a fun line to collect. It's one of my favorite shapes. So that's going to be it for now, and next time I think we'll look at American Beauty.